Video 21, Part 18B of 25, Inputs to the Plan Communications Management Process. The purpose of this video is to develop a WBS to present the inputs to the Plan Communications Management Process. The Plan Communications Management Process is the process in the Project Communications Management knowledge area and is related to the Planning Process Group. Please click the like button. Subscribe to my channel and share with others. How important is the input of project charter to the PMBOK Plan Communications Management Process? The input of the project charter to the Plan Communications Management Process is fundamentally important and serves as a primary source of authority and high-level requirements. It is not just a minor input, it is the foundational document that kickstarts the entire planning process for communications. Here's a detailed breakdown of its importance, following the PMBOK structure. 1. It provides formal authority. The project charter officially authorizes the project and the project manager. This authority is essential for the communications management plan because it empowers the project manager to request resources, schedule meetings, and demand information from stakeholders, which are all core activities of project communications. 2. It defines key stakeholders and high-level expectations. The charter explicitly identifies the project sponsor and the key stakeholders. You cannot plan communications without knowing who you are communicating with. The sponsor's expectations, in particular, are critical as they will often dictate the style, frequency, and content of high-level status reports. 3. It contains high-level project requirements and objectives. The project's high-level objectives and success criteria, as stated in the charter, directly inform what needs to be communicated. The communications plan must be designed to report on progress toward these specific objectives. For example, if a key objective is achieve a 15% market share, communications must include metrics tracking progress toward that goal. 4. It outlines the project's overall approach. The charter often describes the high-level life cycle and approach, such as predictive, agile, or hybrid. This is a critical input for the communications plan. An agile project will require daily stand-up communications and demo reviews, while a predictive project will rely more on formal phase gate reports. 5. It identifies assumptions and constraints. Every communications plan operates within constraints, such as budget, technology, and time, and is built on assumptions. The charter documents these at a high level, as follows. First, constraint example. The project must use the corporate SharePoint site. This directly dictates a communication tool. Second, assumption example. Key stakeholders are available for a monthly steering committee. This directly shapes a communication event. How can a poor project charter analysis harm the PMBOK Plan Communications Management Process? A poor analysis of the project charter doesn't just create a minor inconvenience for the Plan Communications Management Process, it fundamentally corrupts it from the very beginning. Here's a detailed breakdown of how a poor project charter analysis specifically harms the Plan Communications Management Process, following the PMBOK framework. 1. Incomplete or incorrect stakeholder identification. Imagine the following problem. A rushed charter analysis fails to properly identify all key stakeholders, especially the sponsor, subject matter experts, or influential but less obvious stakeholders. The communications management is harmed in the following ways. First, critical people are left out. Vital decisions or status updates are not communicated to the right people, leading to delays, rework, and surprise. Second, wasted effort. Time and resources are wasted communicating with irrelevant parties while missing the true decision makers. Third, stakeholder sabotage. An influential but unidentified stakeholder can actively or passively derail the project because they feel excluded. 2. Misunderstanding of project purpose and success criteria. Imagine the following problem. The project manager fails to grasp the strategic objectives and the specific definition of done, as stated in the charter. The communications management is harmed in the following ways. First, irrelevant reporting. Status reports and dashboards will track the wrong metrics. The team might report on being on budget, while the sponsor cares most about a specific feature that enables a strategic goal. Second, misaligned messaging. Communications to the team and stakeholders will lack a clear why, reducing buy-in and focus. The project's narrative will be weak and confusing. 3. Ignoring key assumptions and constraints. Imagine the following problem. The project manager overlooks the assumptions and constraints section of the charter, treating them as mere formalities. The communications management is harmed in the following way. An impractical plan. The communications plan might rely on technology, a constraint that isn't approved, or assume stakeholder availability, an assumption that isn't realistic. For example, if the charter states a constraint to use only the corporate intranet, but the project manager plans for flashy external video conferences, the plan is dead on arrival. If an assumption that vendors will provide weekly data is false, the communication rhythm for reporting will be based on non-existent information. 4. Unrealistic expectations set from the start. Imagine the following problem. The charter contains high-level milestones and budgets that are optimistic or not well defined. A poor analysis accepts these at face value without questioning their feasibility. The communications management is harmed in the following ways. First, constant bad news reporting. From the very first status report, the project will be reporting variances. This creates a negative and defensive communication climate from the start. Second, erosion of trust. The project manager and team lose credibility because their communications consistently highlight failures against an unrealistic baseline. 5. Adopting the wrong project lifecycle and approach. Imagine the following problem. The charter may specify or imply a project approach, such as agile, predictive, or hybrid. A poor analysis misses this nuance. The communications management is harmed in the following way. Completely inappropriate communication rhythm. In an agile project, the communications plan must include daily stand-ups, sprint reviews, and retrospectives. A predictive plan would focus on phase gate reviews and formal status reports. Using the wrong model leads to chaos. For example, a project manager using a detailed, monthly reporting cycle for a fast-paced agile software project would completely fail to keep the team aligned and the sponsor informed. In conclusion, a poor project charter analysis doesn't just give you a bad communications management plan. It gives you a plan for a different project. It ensures that the most critical element of project management, communication, is misaligned with the project's authority, purpose, and people from the very first step. The time saved by skimping on charter analysis is paid back 100-fold in confusion, conflict, and corrective actions throughout the project's life. As a final message, the project charter is not merely a helpful document for planning communications, it is an essential and authoritative input. It provides the critical context, boundaries, and stakeholder information without which an effective and aligned communications management plan cannot be created. Ignoring the charter when planning communications would lead to a plan that is disconnected from the project's authority, objectives, and key stakeholders, ultimately resulting in miscommunication and project failure. How important is the input of project management plan to the PMBOK plan communications management process? The input of the project management plan is critically important and foundational to the plan communications management process. It is not just one input among many. It is the primary source of context, constraints, and guidance for planning all aspects of project communications. Here's a detailed breakdown of why the project management plan is so important. 1. Provides the strategic context. Communications must support the overall project strategy and objectives. The plan defines what success is, and communications must be aligned to drive the project toward that success. 2. Defines constraints and boundaries. The project's budget, schedule, and resource limitations directly impact the communication methods you can use, such as a tight budget may preclude expensive video conferences or printed reports. 3. Identifies key stakeholders. You cannot communicate effectively if you don't know your audience. The Stakeholder Engagement Plan, a component of the Project Management Plan, is a direct input for identifying who needs what information. 4. Establishes the rules of the game. The development approach, such as predictive, agile, or hybrid, fundamentally dictates the rhythm, style, and tools for communication, such as daily stand-ups versus monthly status reports. 5. Key components of the project management plan and their influence. The project management plan is an integrated document, and several of its components are vital inputs to the communications planning process, as follows. First, Resource Management Plan. It identifies team members and their locations, such as collocated, virtual, and global, which influences communication technology choices and meeting times. It also defines reporting hierarchies and team roles, clarifying communication channels. Second, Stakeholder Engagement Plan. This is arguably the most direct input. It identifies all stakeholders, their communication requirements, their preferred formats, frequency, and their level of influence, interest. The Communications Management Plan is essentially the how-to guide for executing the engagement strategy for these stakeholders. Third, Requirements Management Plan indicates how requirements will be tracked, reported, and validated. This dictates what status information needs to be communicated regarding scope and requirements. Fourth, Change Management Plan defines the process for submitting, approving, and communicating changes. The Communications Management Plan must detail how approved changes and their impacts will be communicated to the affected stakeholders. Fifth, Scope Baseline, Scope Statement, WBS, WBS Dictionary, defines the project's deliverables and boundaries. Communications about progress must be framed within this agreed-upon scope. The WBS provides the structure for reporting progress. Sixth, Schedule Baseline, determines the timing and frequency of progress reporting. Milestones are key communication events. Seventh, Cost Baseline, dictates the reporting needs for financial performance, such as EVM reports and budget forecasts. 8. Quality Management Plan specifies reporting requirements for quality metrics, audits, and control measurements. This defines what quality data needs to be communicated. 9th, Risk Management Plan defines roles and responsibilities for risk communication. It specifies how risks, such as threats and opportunities, will be reported and escalated, and to whom. 10th, Development Approach and Lifecycle. A predictive waterfall project will have formal, document-heavy communication, such as status reports and change requests. But an agile project will have frequent, informal, and collaborative communication, such as daily scrums, sprint reviews, and Kanban boards. How can a poor project management plan analysis harm the PMBOK plan communications management process? A poor analysis of the project management plan doesn't just create a minor inconvenience for the plan communications management process, it fundamentally undermines it, leading to a communication plan that is misaligned, inefficient, and often detrimental to the project. A poor analysis leads to a communications management plan built on faulty assumptions, missing critical audiences, and using inappropriate methods. The result is a cascade of negative outcomes. Here we present the specific harms related to project management plan components. 1. Poor stakeholder engagement plan analysis leads to the following. First, missing key stakeholders entirely. Second, misunderstanding their expectations, influence, or information needs. Third, incorrectly categorizing their level of interest. The harm caused by a poor stakeholder engagement plan analysis is shown as follows. First, stakeholder surprises. Influential stakeholders are left in the dark and become blockers. Second, information gaps or overload, sending the wrong information, or too much, too little, leading to frustration. Third, low engagement and support, critical stakeholders feel ignored and withdraw their support. 2. Poor resource management plan analysis leads to the following. First, not understanding the team's geographical distribution, such as missing remote team members. Second, unaware of language or cultural barriers. Third, ignoring team availability and working hours. The harm caused by a poor resource management plan analysis is shown as follows. First, ineffective channels, choosing real-time meetings for a team spread across 10 time zones, leading to burnout. Second, exclusion. Remote team members feel isolated and miss critical information shared in ad hoc office conversations. Third, miscommunication. Cultural nuances are missed, causing offense or misunderstanding. 3. Poor understanding of development approach life cycle leads to applying a rigid, predictive communication style, such as detailed reports, to an agile project that needs rapid, collaborative communication, such as stand-ups and demos, or vice versa. The harm caused by a poor understanding of development approach lifecycle is shown as follows. First, inefficiency and friction. The team sees status reporting as a bureaucratic waste of time, not a value add. Second, lack of transparency. In an agile project, the lack of demos and daily syncs hides progress and obstacles from the product owner and stakeholders. 4. Poor scope, schedule, and cost baseline analysis leads to the following. First, unclear about what progress actually means and what needs to be reported. Second, reporting on the wrong milestones or deliverables. Third, not understanding the frequency of financial reporting required. The harm caused by a poor scope, schedule, and cost baseline analysis is shown as follows. First, misleading status reports, reporting 90% done on a task that is poorly defined, giving a false sense of security. Second, missed early warnings, failing to communicate schedule variances because the baseline for comparison was not understood or used. Third, budget surprises. Sponsors are unaware of looming cost overruns because financial communication was not tied to the cost baseline. 5. Poor change management plan analysis leads to not having a clear process for communicating changes. The harm caused by a poor change management plan analysis is shown as follows. First, chaos and rework. Stakeholders and team members hear about scope changes through the rumor mill instead of an official channel, leading to confusion and work on the wrong things. Second, scope creep. Without a formal communication process for approved changes, the baseline scope is quickly forgotten. 6. Poor risk management plan analysis leads to the following. First, not knowing who to escalate specific risks to. Second, unclear on the thresholds for communicating risks. The harm caused by a poor risk management plan analysis is shown as follows. First, silent crises. A major risk materializes into an issue, but the right people, such as the sponsor, are not informed in time to mitigate it. Second, crying wolf. Communicating every minor risk, overwhelming stakeholders and desensitizing them to truly critical threats. In conclusion, to summarize, the project management plan is not just important, it is essential and foundational to the plan communications management process. It provides the critical context that transforms a generic communication plan into a tailored, effective, and integrated strategy that actively contributes to project success. Planning communications in a vacuum, without the integrated guidance of the overall project plan, is a recipe for miscommunication, stakeholder dissatisfaction, and project failure. As a final message, in the framework of PMBOK, processes are integrated. A poor analysis of the project management plan doesn't just create a bad communication plan in isolation. It severs the vital link between the project's core strategy and its communication engine. The communications process, instead of being a powerful tool for alignment and control, becomes a source of noise, confusion, and risk, actively driving the project toward failure. How important is the input of project documents to the plan communications management process? The input of project documents to the plan communications management process is critically important and foundational. Let's look at the most impactful project documents and how they directly shape the communications plan. 1. Stakeholder Register and Stakeholder Engagement Plan. Regarding the importance, this is arguably the most critical input. You cannot plan who to communicate with without knowing who your stakeholders are. Here we present how it contributes to the plan. First, identifies audience. Provides the complete list of individuals, groups, and organizations. Second, defines messaging, their interests, expectations, and influence, from the power interest grid. Dictate the content, tone, and frequency of communication. A high-power, high-interest stakeholder needs different information than a low-influence team member. Third, guides format, their communication preferences, such as prefers a weekly email summary versus requires a formal monthly report, directly shape the technology and methods you choose. 2. Requirements documentation and scope baseline. Regarding the importance, it defines what needs to be communicated about the project's deliverables. Here we present how it contributes to the plan. First, technical content, the nature of the requirements, such as highly technical software APIs versus broad marketing goals, determines which stakeholders need detailed technical reports versus high-level progress updates. Second, change management. The WBS and scope statement are the baseline against which changes are measured. Communication about scope changes is a formal process defined in the communications plan, rooted in these documents. 3. Project schedule. Regarding the importance, it dictates when communication needs to happen. Here we present how it contributes to the plan. First, milestone reporting. Key milestones and deadlines become natural triggers for communication, such as milestone report due within 3 days of completion. Second, cadence. The overall project timeline influences the cadence of status updates, such as weekly for a 3-month project or monthly for a 3-year project. 4. Assumption log and risk register. Regarding the importance, it highlights what potential issues and uncertainties need to be communicated. Here we present how it contributes to the plan. First, Risk reporting. High-priority risks require specific communication strategies, such as immediate escalation to the steering committee. Second, proactive communication. The plan must include protocols for communicating when a risk is triggered or an assumption is proven false. 5. Resource management plan. Regarding the importance, it defines the human resources involved in both sending and receiving communications. Here we present how it contributes to the plan. Team structure. The project organization chart, often in this plan, clarifies reporting lines and who is responsible for communicating specific types of information. How can a poor project documents analysis harm the plan communications management process? A poor analysis of project documents doesn't just create minor communication hiccups. It fundamentally corrupts the plan communications management process from its core, leading to a cascade of failures. Here's a detailed breakdown of how poor analysis of specific documents causes direct harm. 1. Harm caused by inadequate stakeholder analysis in the stakeholder register and engagement plan. This is the most damaging area of poor analysis, as follows. First consequence. Missing key stakeholders. The problem here is failing to identify a powerful stakeholder, such as a regulatory body or a senior manager in another department. Their requirements are not captured, and they are blindsided by the project's outcomes, leading to last-minute rejections, compliance issues, or active opposition. Second consequence. Misunderstanding influence and interest. The problem here is treating a high-power, high-interest stakeholder, like the project sponsor, with generic, infrequent updates. They feel out of the loop and lose confidence, potentially leading to budget cuts or project cancellation. Conversely, you overwhelm a low-influence stakeholder with excessive detail, causing noise and frustration. Third consequence. Ignoring communication preferences. The problem here is sending detailed technical reports to an executive who prefers a one-page dashboard, so they ignore your updates. You rely on email for a team that uses a collaborative chat platform, so critical messages are missed. 2. Harm caused by inadequate scope and requirements analysis in the requirements documentation and WBS. First consequence. Ineffective content creation. The problem here is that without understanding the technical complexity of the requirements, your status reports are too vague for the technical team and too detailed for the business stakeholders. No one gets the information they need to make decisions. Second consequence. Unmanaged change communication. The problem here is that the link between a scope change and its communication plan is broken. Changes are not formally announced to all affected parties, leading to rework, confusion about deliverables, and scope creep. 3. Harm caused by inadequate schedule analysis in the project schedule. First consequence. Missed communication triggers. The problem here is failing to link communication to key milestones. A major deliverable is completed, but the stakeholder review meeting isn't scheduled for another 2 weeks, causing a project delay. Urgent decisions are needed, but the governance forum hasn't been scheduled. Second consequence. Irrelevant cadence. The problem here is setting a monthly status report for a 2-week sprint-based project, making the reports useless. Conversely, you demand daily detailed reports on a multi-year project, burying the team in administration. 4. Harm caused by poor risk and assumptions analysis in the risk register and assumption log. First consequence. No crisis communication plan. The problem here is that high-impact risk materializes, but because it wasn't analyzed properly, there is no predefined escalation path or communication strategy. The team panics, communicates inconsistently, and damages stakeholder trust. Second consequence. Unvalidated assumptions. The problem here is that plan assumes a key resource will be available, but this was never formally communicated as a critical assumption. When the resource is pulled, the project is delayed, and stakeholders are surprised and angry because they were never made aware of this dependency. In conclusion, a poor analysis of project documents doesn't just create a few typos in a plan. It systematically injects failure points into the project's lifeblood, its communication. The resulting communications management plan is not just weak, it is dangerously misleading, creating an illusion of control while setting the stage for misunderstandings, conflicts, and ultimately, project failure. It is a classic case of garbage in, garbage out, where the foundational ignorance of the project's context guarantees a flawed and ineffective communication strategy. As a final message, to say that project documents are an input is an understatement. They are the raw material, the intelligence, and the requirements for the entire plan communications management process. A communications plan built without deep integration of these documents is generic, theoretical, and destined to fail. A plan built with them is targeted, practical, and is a primary driver of project success. How important is the input of enterprise environmental factors to the plan communications management process? The input of enterprise environmental factors is critically important and fundamental to the plan communications management process. It is arguably one of the most significant influences on how a project manager shapes the communications strategy. The plan communications management process is about determining who needs what information, when they need it, how it will be delivered, and by whom. Enterprise environmental factors provide the pre-existing conditions that answer these questions. Think of it this way. You can't plan how to communicate if you don't first understand the environment in which you are communicating. Here's a breakdown of why enterprise environmental factors are so crucial. With specific examples, key enterprise environmental factors and their direct impact. 1. Organizational culture, structure, and governance. A hierarchical, centralized organization will have formal communication channels, such as all reports must go up the chain of command. A flat, agile organization will encourage more informal, direct, and collaborative communication, such as daily stand-ups and Slack channels. For example, you can't plan to send a weekly project update directly to the CEO if the company's governance requires it to be filtered through 3 layers of VPs first. 2. Stakeholder risk appetite and culture. The level of detail and frequency of communication are directly tied to what stakeholders are comfortable with. Some cultures prefer detailed, data-heavy reports, others prefer high-level summaries. For example, a stakeholder group that is highly risk-averse will require more frequent and detailed risk reporting than one with a high tolerance for uncertainty. 3. Established communication channels and tools. You don't get to choose your tools in a vacuum. The company may have enterprise-wide licenses for Microsoft Teams, Jira, or SAP, making them the default. Your plan must leverage these existing systems. For example, if the entire company uses SharePoint for document management, your communication plan must specify that project documents will be stored and version controlled there, not on a separate Google Drive. 4. Personnel administration and policies. Policies on confidentiality, data security, and legal requirements will dictate what information can be shared, with whom, and in what format. For example, a project in the healthcare sector or finance will have strict communication protocols about what data can be included in an email or report. 5. Geographic distribution of team members and stakeholders. This is a massive driver of the communication plan. A co-located team can have face-to-face meetings. A global, Virtual team requires a plan focused on technology, such as using video conferencing, asynchronous communication, and sensitivity to time zones. For example, your plan must schedule meetings at a time that is reasonable for team members in North America, Europe, and Asia, and cannot rely on impromptu desk-side chats. 6. Industry standards and marketplace conditions. Your external stakeholders, such as customers, regulators, and suppliers, have expectations shaped by industry norms. For example, a construction project must have communication plans that adhere to specific regulatory reporting standards. A software project for a public company must consider communication around earnings calls. How can a poor enterprise environmental factors analysis harm the plan communications management process? A poor or incomplete analysis of enterprise environmental factors doesn't just make the communications management plan suboptimal, it actively sets the project up for communication failures, which are a primary source of project conflict and derailment. Here's a detailed breakdown of how a poor enterprise environmental factors analysis directly harms the plan communications management process. 1. The communication plan becomes impractical and inefficient. The plan will be based on assumptions rather than reality, leading to immediate operational failures as follows. First, using the wrong tools. The plan might specify using Slack for instant collaboration, but if the organization's enterprise environmental factors is a strict, legacy-based IT infrastructure that only supports Microsoft Teams and formal email, the plan is dead on arrival. Team members will either ignore it or waste time trying to make unauthorized tools work. Second, ineffective channels. The plan might schedule daily video conferences for a team spread across 10 time zones, completely ignoring the geographic distribution of resources, which is an enterprise environmental factors. This leads to burnout, low attendance, and resentment from team members forced to join calls in the middle of the night. Third, ignoring cultural norms. A plan that mandates blunt, direct feedback in a culture that values harmony and indirect communication will cause offense, shut down dialogue, and destroy trust. 2. Active alienation and frustration of stakeholders. This is where the damage moves from operational to relational, as follows. First, information mismatch. Without understanding the stakeholder risk appetite, which is an enterprise environmental factor, you might send high-level, optimistic summaries to a detail-oriented, risk-averse sponsor. This will make them anxious and lose confidence in your leadership, as they feel they aren't getting the real story. Second, violating governance and hierarchy. A poor analysis of the organizational structure and governance, which is an enterprise environmental factor, might lead you to bypass middle managers and communicate directly with their teams. This violates protocol, undermines authority, and creates powerful enemies who can obstruct the project. Third, information overload or famine. Without understanding the existing workload and communication culture, which is an enterprise environmental factors, you might flood certain stakeholders with reports they don't need, causing them to ignore all your messages. Conversely, you might undercommunicate with others, leaving them feeling excluded and unsupported. 3. Increased risk, rework, and project delays. Poor communication creates tangible project defects and schedule slips as follows. First, misunderstood requirements. If you fail to analyze the industry standards, which is an enterprise environmental factor, you might use internal jargon in requirements documents that external suppliers interpret differently. This leads to deliverables that don't meet the actual need, requiring expensive rework. Second, slow decision-making. A plan that doesn't account for formal approval chains, which is a governance enterprise environmental factors, will create bottlenecks. You might be waiting for a decision from someone who, according to company policy, isn't the actual decision maker, causing critical path delays. Third, unmanaged risks. Without understanding the political landscape and power structures, which is a soft but critical enterprise environmental factors, you might fail to communicate emerging risks to the right person who can mitigate them. The risk then materializes, causing a crisis that could have been avoided. 4. Compliance, security, and legal breaches. This is the most severe category of harm, with potential consequences extending far beyond the project, as follows. First, data security violations. A catastrophic failure would be creating a plan that uses an unapproved, insecure file-sharing service, like a personal Dropbox, because you didn't analyze the personnel administration and data security policies' enterprise environmental factors. This could lead to a data breach, regulatory fines, and significant reputational damage. Second, legal non-compliance. In regulated industries, such as healthcare and finance, a communications plan that doesn't adhere to strict auditing and record-keeping requirements, which is an enterprise environmental factors, can result in legal action, loss of licenses, and massive penalties. In conclusion, enterprise environmental factors are not a minor input. They are the foundational context that makes your communications plan realistic, practical, and integrated into the organization. A good project manager always starts by asking, what are the environmental factors that will shape how we communicate on this project? In contrast, a poor enterprise environmental factors analysis doesn't just create a bad piece of paper, which is the communications plan. It disconnects the plan from the reality of the organization, its people, and its rules. This disconnect leads directly to inefficiency, stakeholder conflict, project delays, and in severe cases, legal and security repercussions. The communications management plan becomes a source of problems rather than the solution to them. If a project manager fails to adequately consider enterprise environmental factors when planning communications, the project is likely to face, first, ineffective communication. Messages get lost, are sent to the wrong people, or use the wrong medium. Second, stakeholder dissatisfaction. Key decision-makers feel out of the loop, while others are bombarded with irrelevant information. Third, rework and delays. Miscommunication leads to errors and misunderstandings that must be corrected. Fourth, conflict. Lack of clear, culturally sensitive communication can create tension within the team and with stakeholders. Fifth, non-compliance. Violating organizational or legal policies regarding communication and data handling. As a final message, effective communication management planning is impossible without a thorough understanding of the company's environmental factors. An inadequate analysis of the company's environmental factors not only creates a poor document, but also turns the communication management plan into a source of problems rather than a solution. How important is the input of organizational process assets to the plan communications management process? The input of organizational process assets is critically important, foundational, and highly influential to the plan communications management process. In fact, it's difficult to imagine performing this process effectively without leveraging organizational process assets. They provide the historical knowledge, established rules, and reusable infrastructure that prevent the project manager from having to reinvent the wheel for every project. Here's a breakdown of why they are so important, categorized by the types of organizational process assets and their specific impact. 1. Historical information and lessons learned repository. This is perhaps the most valuable part of organizational process assets for planning communications. These are archives of past projects, both successful and failed, including which communication approaches worked and which didn't. stakeholder analyses, and specific lessons learned about managing expectations. And the impact on plan communications management is now presented as follows. First, informs strategy. You can see how similar projects in the past communicated with similar stakeholder groups. Did they use weekly emails, a dashboard, or monthly steering committee meetings? Second, prevents past mistakes. If a previous project failed because stakeholders were surprised by a risk, you know to build a more proactive risk communication plan. Third, sets realistic baselines. Historical data helps you estimate the effort and cost for communication activities more accurately. 2. Established communication requirements and standards. The organization often has predefined rules about communication. These are corporate policies, procedures, and standards for communication. This can include brand guidelines, security protocols for sensitive information, mandatory reporting requirements, such as for compliance or governance, and standard templates for reports, emails, and presentations. And the impact on plan communications management is now presented as follows. First, defines constraints. You must plan communications within these guardrails. For example, you might be required to use a specific template for the monthly project status report sent to the project management office. Second, ensures consistency. Using standard templates and formats ensures your project's communications are professional and consistent with the rest of the organization, building credibility. Third, saves time. You don't have to create communication formats from scratch. 3. Historical and predefined stakeholder registers and analysis. While each project has unique stakeholders, there are always recurring ones. These are stakeholder registers and analysis documents from previous, similar projects. And the impact on plan communications management is now presented as follows. First, jumpstarts identification. Provides a starting point for identifying key stakeholders you might otherwise overlook, such as a specific legal or compliance officer. Second, reveals relationships and influence. Past documents can shed light on the power dynamics, interests, and communication preferences of influential stakeholders. 4. Knowledge repositories and filing structures. This relates to how and where information is stored and accessed. These include the organization's defined archiving structure for projects, shared drives, SharePoint sites, and other knowledge bases. And the impact on plan communications management is now presented as follows. First, defines the where. Your communications plan must specify where project documents and reports will be stored. Organizational process assets often dictate this location, ensuring all organizational knowledge is centralized. Second, facilitates access control. The repository's built-in security settings will influence how you plan to manage access to different types of communication, such as public, restricted, or confidential. 5. Formal and informal communication channels and tools. The organization's existing technological and social infrastructure. These are the tools of the trade. This includes approved software, such as Microsoft Teams, Slack, Jira, and email systems, as well as understood informal channels, such as the best way to get a quick answer from the finance team is to walk over to their area. And the impact on plan communications management is now presented as follows. First, determines the how. Your plan will be built around the available and sanctioned tools. You can't plan to use a tool the organization hasn't approved or doesn't have a license for. Second, influences efficiency. Choosing the right pre-existing tool from the organizational process assets ensures communication is efficient and that stakeholders don't have to learn a new system just for your project. How can a poor organizational process assets analysis harm the plan communications management process? A poor analysis of organizational process assets doesn't just make the plan communications management process harder, it actively sets it up for failure. The harm is pervasive and can manifest in several critical ways, leading to inefficiency, conflict, and ultimately, project failure. Here's a breakdown of how a poor organizational process assets analysis can specifically harm the communication planning process. 1. Reinventing the wheel and inefficiency. The problem here is that the project team wastes immense time and effort creating communication templates, reports, and channels from scratch that already exist and are proven within the organization. And the result is delays in initial communication, inconsistent branding, and a frustrated team that spends time on administrative tasks instead of value-added work. 2. Non-compliance and ignoring critical standards. The problem here is that the communication plan inadvertently violates organizational policies, legal requirements, or security protocols. And the result is this. First, using an unapproved, insecure file sharing service, leading to a data breach. Second, not including a mandatory compliance officer in critical communication loops. Third, publicly sharing sensitive information that should have been restricted, leading to legal or reputational damage. 3. Repeating past communication failures. The problem here is that the project is doomed to repeat the exact same communication mistakes that derailed previous initiatives. And the result is this. First, a key stakeholder group, such as the legal department, is overlooked again, causing last-minute roadblocks. Second, the team uses a confusing status report format that was already identified as ineffective 2 projects ago. Third, a previously successful stakeholder is frustrated by being communicated with in a way that failed in the past. 4. Misunderstanding the political and cultural landscape. The problem here is that the communication plan is technically sound but culturally tone-deaf, alienating key influencers and stakeholders. And the result is this. First, sending a blunt, direct email in an organization that values formal, diplomatic communication, offending a senior sponsor. Second, bypassing a middle manager who expects to be the communication conduit for their team, creating a powerful adversary. Third, failing to use the right channel for the audience, such as an informal chat tool for a formal executive update. 5. Choosing ineffective or unsupported tools. The problem here is that the plan relies on communication tools that are unfamiliar, unsupported by IT, or inaccessible to key stakeholders. And the result is this. First, critical stakeholders cannot access the project portal because it doesn't work with the company's single sign-on. Second, the IT department refuses to support the tool, leaving the team to handle technical issues. Third, adoption is low because people are comfortable and proficient with the existing, standard toolset. 6. Flawed stakeholder analysis and engagement. The problem here is that the communication plan is built on an incomplete picture of who the stakeholders are and what they need. The result is this. First, missing a hidden but influential stakeholder, such as a data governance officer, who halts the project late in its life cycle. Second, misjudging the power or interest of a stakeholder group, leading to over-communication and annoying them, or under-communication and surprising them. In conclusion, organizational process assets are not just an important input, they are the bedrock of the plan communications management process. They provide the necessary context, constraints, and collective wisdom that allow a project manager to create a communication management plan that is, first, Efficient because it leverages existing systems and templates. Second, effective because it's based on what has worked and what has not worked in the past. Third, compliant because it adheres to organizational policies and standards. Fourth, consistent because it aligns with the organization's culture and practices. On the other hand, ignoring organizational process assets would lead to a communication plan that is likely incomplete, inefficient, and disconnected from the organizational environment, significantly increasing the risk of project failure due to miscommunication and stakeholder dissatisfaction. The harm doesn't stop with a poorly written plan. It cascades into project execution as follows. First, misalignment and confusion. In this case, the stakeholders receive inconsistent, late, or unclear information, leading to confusion about goals, progress, and their own roles. Second, lack of trust and support. In this case, when communication is inefficient, non-compliant, or repeats past failures, stakeholders lose confidence in the project team's competence. Third, rework and delays. In this case, miscommunication causes teams to work on the wrong things or in the wrong way, requiring expensive and time-consuming rework. Fourth, unmanaged expectations. In this case, without a solid plan based on historical norms, stakeholders are frequently surprised by bad news or project changes, leading to conflict. Fifth, project failure. In this case, in extreme cases, the cumulative effect of poor communication, rooted in a failure to learn from and use organizational assets, can directly lead to the project being cancelled or failing to deliver its intended benefits. As a final message, the organizational process assets analysis is critically important, foundational, and highly influential to the plan communications management process because they provide the historical knowledge, established rules, and reusable infrastructure that prevent the project manager from having to reinvent the wheel for every project. In contrast, a poor organizational process assets analysis for the plan communications management process is not a minor oversight, it's a critical failure in organizational learning. It forces the project team to operate in a vacuum, blind to the established rules, proven practices, and hard-won lessons of the past. The resulting communication plan is likely to be inefficient, ineffective, and risky, creating a fragile foundation for the entire project. This video is finished, but we will have in the next videos. 1. Creation of WBS for different projects using WBS Schedule Pro. 2. Examples of project plans using MS Project. And many more videos. Don't forget to give a thumbs up if you like this video and want us to continue with new topics. Subscribe to the channel. All content is free. You can also comment suggesting topics you would like to see on this channel. Thank you.